The fluorescent lights in the Millbrook Sheriff's Department had been flickering for 3 months, casting an intermittent glow across the bulletin board where Emily Flores smiled back from her 1983 graduation photo. Detective Rebecca Torres had walked past that image countless times during her 2 years at the department, each glance a reminder of the cases that haunted small-town law enforcement, the ones that slipped through the cracks when resources were thin and leads went cold. The photo's edges had curled with age, the thumbtack holding it in place had rusted, and Emily's bright smile seemed to fade a little more each year. On that Tuesday morning in March 2023, Torres was nursing her second cup of coffee when her desk phone rang with the kind of call that changes everything. Dr. Jennifer Martinez from the State Forensics Laboratory spoke with clinical precision. But Torres could hear something else beneath the surface: excitement, maybe even disbelief. The DNA results from the genealogical database had returned with a familial match. After 40 years of silence, Emily Flores was about to speak again. Torres felt her pulse quicken as she reached for a pen, her hand trembling slightly as she prepared to write down information that would resurrect a case most people in Millbrook had forgotten. The laboratory had processed genetic material from evidence that had sat untouched in Box 47 since Ronald Reagan was president, when DNA testing was still science fiction and hope was all Catherine Flores had left. The breakthrough had come through a process called genetic genealogy, a technique that could trace family trees through DNA databases populated by people searching for their ancestry, never knowing they might be helping solve murders. The match wasn't direct. It was a third cousin, someone who had submitted their saliva to a commercial genealogy company to learn about their Irish heritage and accidentally provided the key to a 4-decade-old mystery. Dr. Martinez explained how forensic genealogists had built family trees, working backward and forward through generations until they narrowed down to a single name that made Torres's blood run cold. Someone she recognized. Someone who had been living in plain sight while Catherine Flores aged 20 years in the span of 5, while memorial candles burned in church windows, while a town slowly forgot that Emily Flores had ever existed. Torres hung up the phone and stared at Emily's photograph with new eyes. The girl in the picture suddenly felt less like a relic and more like a person demanding justice. The detective walked to the evidence room, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, and pulled Box 47 from its dusty shelf. Inside were fragments of a life interrupted. Emily's driver's license, crime scene photographs that had faded to an amber tint, witness statements typed on a manual typewriter, and sealed evidence bags that had been waiting 40 years for technology to catch up with truth. June 15, 1983, dawned muggy and thick across central Pennsylvania, the kind of weather that made promises feel possible and danger seem impossible. Emily Flores had been counting down the days until the Clarion County Fair, circling the date on her bedroom calendar with a red pen and talking about it with the infectious enthusiasm that made everyone around her smile. At 18, with graduation behind her and college ahead, Emily moved through Millbrook like someone who owned the future. Murphy's Diner sat on the corner of Main and Elm, a rectangular building with aluminum siding and windows that fogged up when the coffee was fresh and the air conditioning struggled. Emily had been working there since her junior year, saving money for college expenses that her scholarship wouldn't cover. Frank Murphy, the owner, treated her like the daughter he never had, and the regular customers had watched her transform from a shy 16-year-old into a confident young woman who remembered how everyone liked their coffee and never forgot to ask about their grandchildren. That Tuesday, Emily served her last customer at 4:25, a traveling salesman who ordered pie and complained about the heat. She untied her apron, hung it on the hook by the kitchen door, and waved goodbye to Frank, who was already prepping for the dinner rush. Her red Chevette sat in the gravel parking lot, windows cracked to let out the heat that had been building all day. The car was her pride and joy, a symbol of independence that she had helped her mother choose from the used car lot on Route 322. Emily had planned to drive home, shower, and change into the sundress she had bought specifically for the fair. Her friends Jessica Rodriguez and Amy Thompson were meeting her at 7:30 by the Ferris wheel, and they had pooled their money for ride tickets and carnival food. It was the kind of innocent evening that small towns were built on, the kind of memory that should have lasted a lifetime. But Emily Flores never made it home. At 8:15 that evening, Harold Jenkins was driving back from his job at the lumber mill when his headlights caught something that didn't belong. A red Chevette sat crooked on the shoulder of Route 47, driver's door hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. The engine was still running, the radio playing a Duran Duran song to an empty seat. Jenkins pulled over and called out, thinking maybe someone had car trouble. But the only answer was the sound of cicadas and the distant rumble of a freight train crossing the valley. Sheriff James Murphy had been elected to serve Millbrook County more for his ability to settle bar fights and handle domestic disputes than for his expertise in homicide investigation. When Harold Jenkins called in the abandoned Chevette on Route 47, Murphy arrived at the scene with Deputy Bill Costa and a growing sense that this Tuesday evening was about to become something far beyond his department's usual scope. The red car sat like a wound against the darkening landscape, its hazard lights blinking in mechanical rhythm while the engine ticked as it cooled. Murphy's first instinct was logical, but limited. He treated the scene like a missing person case rather than a potential crime scene, allowing Jenkins and two other motorists who had stopped to help to walk around the vehicle, contaminating what would later be recognized as crucial evidence. The sheriff photographed the car with an old Polaroid camera, the flash creating harsh shadows that would make the images nearly useless for forensic analysis. He collected Emily's purse, noting that her wallet contained $43 and her work schedule from Murphy's diner, but he failed to dust for fingerprints on the door handles or steering wheel. The investigation that followed reflected the limitations of rural law enforcement in 1983. Murphy focused his attention on Emily's boyfriend, 19-year-old Tommy Gallagher, subjecting him to 3 interrogations that revealed nothing more than a young man's confusion and grief. Tommy had been working his shift at the auto parts store when Emily disappeared, with time cards and witness statements confirming his alibi, but Murphy's suspicion lingered like smoke in a closed room. The sheriff also spent considerable time investigating transient workers who had been employed at local farms, reasoning that outsiders were more likely to commit violent crimes than hometown residents. What Murphy missed would haunt the case for decades. He failed to canvass the area around Route 47 for additional evidence, missing tire tracks in a nearby field that heavy rains would wash away within days. He didn't interview Emily's guidance counselor, Michael Bauer, despite Bauer's frequent interactions with Emily regarding her college applications. Most critically, Murphy collected Emily's clothing and personal items from the car, but stored them in paper bags in a damp evidence room, where humidity and poor storage conditions would degrade potential DNA evidence that wouldn't be tested for another 4 decades. The Pennsylvania State Police offered assistance, but Murphy's pride and territorial instincts led him to decline their help, insisting that local law enforcement could handle what he still believed was a runaway case. He theorized that Emily had staged her own disappearance, perhaps overwhelmed by college pressure or family expectations. Despite the obvious problems with this explanation, her mother's frantic protests fell on deaf ears, and when Catherine Flores suggested that someone had taken her daughter, Murphy's response was a patronizing pat on the shoulder and assurance that girls Emily's age sometimes just needed space to figure things out. Catherine Flores aged a decade in the first month after Emily disappeared. The woman who had worked double shifts at Millbrook Textile to afford her daughter's graduation dress now found herself unable to concentrate on the simplest tasks, her hands shaking as she tried to operate the industrial sewing machines that had provided their modest income. Sleep became impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Emily's red Chevette with its door hanging open like a scream frozen in time. When Sheriff Murphy's investigation stalled after 6 weeks, Catherine took matters into her own hands with the desperate energy of a mother who refused to accept bureaucratic limitations. She spent her life savings on photocopying missing person flyers, papering every telephone pole, shop window, and community bulletin board within a 50-mile radius, with Emily's graduation photo. The image showed her daughter's bright smile and hopeful eyes, accompanied by text that Catherine had typed on a borrowed typewriter. Missing Emily Flores, 18, brown hair, brown eyes, last seen June 15th, 1983. Please call with any information. Every weekend, Catherine organized search parties that grew smaller as weeks turned to months, and hope began to feel like a luxury the town couldn't afford. She recruited Emily's friends, church members, and anyone willing to walk through the dense woods and abandoned farm buildings that dotted the countryside around Millbrook. They searched with flashlights and called Emily's name until their voices went hoarse, combing through ravines and checking old barns while Catherine followed behind them, her eyes scanning every shadow for a sign of her daughter. Catherine haunted the sheriff's department with the persistence of someone who had nothing left to lose. She appeared at Murphy's office every Tuesday, marking the weekly anniversary of Emily's disappearance, carrying a manila folder filled with newspaper clippings about similar cases, private investigator advertisements, and handwritten lists of people who should be questioned. Murphy's initial sympathy curdled into annoyance, then hardened into the kind of defensive dismissal that small-town officials reserve for persistent problems they cannot solve. The town's response reflected the complicated psychology of communities confronted with inexplicable tragedy. Some neighbors rallied around Catherine with casseroles and prayers, but others began to whisper that perhaps Emily had brought trouble on herself, that good girls from good families didn't simply vanish. The speculation hurt almost as much as the silence, and Catherine found herself defending her daughter's reputation even as she begged for help finding her. She mortgaged the small house she and Emily had shared, using the money to hire a private investigator from Philadelphia who took her payment and delivered a report that contained nothing Sheriff Murphy hadn't already documented. Years blended into each other, marked only by the ritual of Emily's birthday and the anniversary of her disappearance. Catherine kept Emily's bedroom exactly as she had left it, dust accumulating on textbooks that would never be returned to the high school library and college brochures that had arrived in the mail weeks after Emily vanished. Every Christmas, Catherine bought Emily a present and wrapped it carefully, storing it in the closet with all the other gifts for a daughter who might never come home to open them. Box 47 sat on a metal shelf in the evidence room like a mausoleum for the forgotten, its cardboard edges softened by decades of humidity that the aging ventilation system could never quite control. The storage room smelled of dust and deteriorating paper, fluorescent lights humming overhead and casting harsh shadows between towers of boxes that contained the detritus of unsolved crimes stretching back to the 1960s. Detective Rebecca Torres had discovered the box during her systematic review of cold cases, part of a statewide initiative to apply modern forensic techniques to investigations that had stalled before DNA testing became routine. Inside Box 47, Emily Flores existed as fragments and evidence bags sealed with yellowing tape. The rape kit had been collected at the crime scene processing of her abandoned car, swabs taken from the steering wheel, and door handles that Sheriff Murphy had failed to test in 1983. The technology simply didn't exist then, and by the time DNA analysis became standard procedure in the 1990s, Emily's case had been buried under newer investigations and budget constraints that forced departments to prioritize recent crimes over decades-old mysteries. Torres handled each piece of evidence with the reverence of an archaeologist, understanding that she was touching items that represented Emily's last moments of agency before she vanished into the Pennsylvania night. The witness statements were typed on onion skin paper, the ribbon on Sheriff Murphy's typewriter having left some letters fainter than others, creating a document that required careful reading under proper lighting. Harold Jenkins had described finding the car with remarkable detail, noting that the radio was tuned to WQED and that Emily's work shoes had been neatly placed on the floor of the passenger side, suggesting she had changed into different footwear for her planned evening at the fair. The most intriguing piece of evidence was a single unidentified fingerprint lifted from the rearview mirror of Emily's Chevette. The print was partial, but contained enough ridge characteristics to be entered into the FBI's integrated automated fingerprint identification system once it became operational in 1999. For 20 years, that fingerprint had been compared against millions of others in the database, yielding no matches and offering no answers. It became a digital ghost, existing in computer systems but pointing to no one, telling a story that no one could read. The evidence bags contained items that spoke to the ordinariness of Emily's life and the violence of her disappearance. Her work apron from Murphy's Diner, still stained with coffee and bearing the faint smell of bacon grease that had survived 4 decades in storage. A tube of lipstick found under the front seat, the kind of coral pink that had been fashionable in 1983. Most heartbreaking was a handwritten list in Emily's careful cursive, detailing the things she needed to buy for her dorm room at Penn State. Extra long sheets, a desk lamp, a small refrigerator. Torres photographed everything with digital precision that would have seemed like magic to Sheriff Murphy in 1983. She documented the chain of custody, noting gaps where evidence had been transferred between storage facilities and signed out for periodic reviews that led nowhere. The rape kit had been stored improperly for the first 15 years, subjected to temperature fluctuations that degraded some biological material, but advances in low copy number DNA analysis meant that even degraded samples could potentially yield results. The fingerprint remained the wild card, a piece of the puzzle that could unlock everything if the right comparison ever materialized. Torres submitted it for reanalysis using enhanced imaging techniques that could extract details invisible to 1980s technology. She also authorized the DNA testing that would change everything, though she couldn't have known that the breakthrough would come not from the evidence itself, but from a relative of Emily's killer who had submitted their genetic material to a genealogy website in search of their family tree, accidentally providing the key to a crime they never knew had been committed. Detective Rebecca Torres had been working Emily Flores' case for 8 months when she made the decision that would finally crack it open. Sitting in her office on a grey February morning in 2020, surrounded by crime scene photographs and evidence reports that had yielded nothing but frustration, Torres picked up her phone and called the State Forensics Laboratory. "Doctor," Jennifer Martinez answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the weary efficiency of someone who dealt with tragedy as a matter of routine. But Torres could hear genuine interest when she explained what she needed. Genetic genealogy was still relatively new in law enforcement, a technique that had gained national attention through high-profile cases like the Golden State Killer, but had yet to be applied to most small-town cold cases. The process required extracting DNA from decades-old evidence and uploading the genetic profile to public genealogy databases, then building family trees to identify potential suspects through their relatives. It was expensive, time-consuming, and required specialized expertise that most rural departments couldn't afford. But Torres had convinced her chief to allocate funds from a federal grant designed to help solve cold cases. The DNA extraction from Emily's rape kit took 6 weeks, the degraded biological material requiring multiple attempts and advanced techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with compromised samples. Dr. Martinez worked with genetic material that had been stored improperly for decades, using low copy number analysis to amplify DNA fragments that were barely detectable. The resulting profile was partial, missing several key markers, but contained enough genetic information to potentially identify familial relationships. When the profile was uploaded to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database used by amateur family historians and adopted children searching for biological relatives, it immediately generated several potential matches. None were close enough to represent Emily's killer directly, but the closest match was a third cousin with enough shared DNA to indicate they shared great-great-grandparents. The genetic genealogist working the case, a specialist named Dr. Sarah Chen, began the painstaking process of building family trees, working backward through generations of birth records, marriage certificates, and census data. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon in March 2023, when Dr. Chen called Torres with a tremor of excitement in her usually composed voice. The family tree construction had narrowed down to a single branch that contained only 3 potential male suspects born in the right time frame to have committed the crime. One had died in 1995, another had been in prison during June 1983, but the third name made Torres's blood run cold with recognition and disbelief. Michael Bauer had been Emily's guidance counselor at Millbrook High School, a trusted figure who had helped her navigate college applications and scholarship opportunities. Torres remembered interviewing him during her review of the case files, noting that Sheriff Murphy had never spoken to Bauer, despite his obvious connection to Emily. The man had presented himself as helpful and concerned, expressing sadness about Emily's disappearance and praising her academic potential. He had retired from teaching in 2010 and moved to Florida, living quietly in a retirement community where neighbors knew him as a friendly former educator who volunteered at the local library. The revelation recontextualized everything Torres thought she knew about the case. Bauer would have known Emily's schedule, her plans for college, her routine at Murphy's Diner. He would have known she was planning to attend the county fair that evening, information that could have been used to intercept her on Route 47. Most importantly, he would have been above suspicion in 1983, a respected member of the community whose word carried weight and whose access to students was not only accepted but encouraged. Torres felt her hands shake as she wrote Bauer's name in her notebook, understanding that she was looking at the solution to a mystery that had haunted Millbrook for 40 years. But solving the puzzle and proving the case were 2 different challenges entirely, and she knew that the real work was just beginning. Michael Bauer had spent 37 years perfecting the art of being unremarkable. At 64, he moved through the Sunset Palms retirement community in Bradenton, Florida, with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that invisibility was his greatest asset. His neighbors knew him as a retired high school counselor from Pennsylvania, someone who had dedicated his life to helping young people achieve their potential. He volunteered at the community library twice a week, organizing book sales and reading to children during story hour, his gentle demeanor and patient voice earning him the kind of trust that had served him well throughout his career. Detective Torres spent 3 sleepless nights researching Bauer's background after the genetic genealogy results pointed to his family line. The man who emerged from decades of personnel files and newspaper clippings was the perfect predator hiding in plain sight. Bauer had joined Millbrook High School as a guidance counselor in 1979, fresh out of his master's program at Penn State, bringing impressive credentials and glowing recommendations from his student teaching placements. The school district had been thrilled to hire someone of his caliber for a position that typically attracted less qualified candidates. The old Millbrook High School yearbooks told a story that Torres now read with horrifying clarity. Bauer appeared in dozens of photographs, always surrounded by smiling students, his arm draped casually around their shoulders, or his hand resting on their backs in gestures that seemed paternal and appropriate. Emily Flores appeared in several pictures with him, including one taken just weeks before her disappearance, where she was holding her acceptance letter to Penn State, while Bauer beamed beside her with obvious pride. The caption read, "Mr. Bauer helps another student achieve their college dreams." Bauer's position had given him unprecedented access to the most vulnerable students in the school. He knew their family situations, their financial struggles, their academic weaknesses and social insecurities. He was privy to their class schedules, their part-time job hours, their college plans and weekend activities. Students confided in him about their relationships, their fears about the future, their conflicts with parents and teachers. For a predator, it was a treasure trove of information that could be weaponized against victims who trusted him completely. The more Torres learned about Bauer's methodology, the more chilling his selection of Emily became. She was academically gifted but financially vulnerable, dependent on scholarships and part-time work to afford college. She came from a single-parent household where her mother worked long hours and couldn't monitor her daughter's every movement. Most crucially, Emily was on the verge of leaving Millbrook forever, heading to Penn State, where she would be beyond Bauer's reach and influence. If he was going to act, June 1983 represented his last opportunity. Bauer's personnel file revealed a pattern of subtle red flags that had been overlooked or rationalized away by administrators who valued his effectiveness with students. Several parents had expressed discomfort with his tendency to meet with female students behind closed doors, but these concerns were dismissed as misunderstandings or jealousy from less successful counselors. One complaint from 1982 alleged that Bauer had made inappropriate comments about a student's appearance, but the investigation concluded that the student had misinterpreted innocent remarks about her professional presentation. The most damning revelation was Bauer's intimate knowledge of Emily's schedule and plans. As her guidance counselor, he had been helping her navigate the financial aid process for Penn State, scheduling regular meetings to review paperwork and deadlines. He would have known about her job at Murphy's Diner, her work schedule, and her excitement about attending the county fair. He had been present during conversations about her college preparations, listening to details about her life that could be used to predict her movements and identify vulnerable moments. Torres realized that Sheriff Murphy's failure to interview Bauer in 1983 had been more than an oversight. It had been a catastrophic blind spot that allowed a killer to walk free for 40 years. Bauer hadn't just avoided suspicion, he had been so far above it that he was never even considered a potential witness, let alone a suspect. The investigation of Michael Bauer required Detective Torres to reconstruct 40 years of carefully hidden behavior, searching for patterns and evidence that had been buried under decades of respectability and community trust. Working with FBI behavioral analysts and cold case specialists, Torres began the meticulous process of building a case against a man who had spent his entire adult life perfecting the art of manipulation and concealment. The first breakthrough came from Bauer's financial records, obtained through federal subpoenas that traced his banking activity back to 1983. The records revealed something troubling: a cash withdrawal of $500 on June 14, 1983, the day before Emily disappeared, followed by unusual spending patterns that suggested someone trying to establish an alibi. Bauer had made purchases at stores throughout central Pennsylvania in the weeks following Emily's disappearance, creating a paper trail that placed him far from Millbrook during times when he claimed to be home. The transactions suggested someone methodically building evidence of innocuous activity, the behavior of a man who understood that his movements might eventually be scrutinized. More disturbing were the credit card records showing regular travel to other small towns throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states, always during school holidays and summer breaks when his absence from Millbrook wouldn't be noticed. The pattern suggested a predator who expanded his hunting ground beyond his immediate community, possibly to avoid detection or because local opportunities had become limited. FBI analysts cross-referenced Bauer's travel dates with unsolved disappearances and assaults in those areas, finding correlations that made Torres's stomach turn with the implications. The psychological profile that emerged from former students was perhaps the most damning evidence of all. Working through alumni networks and social media, Torres identified dozens of women who had been counseled by Bauer during their high school years. The interviews revealed a consistent pattern of boundary violations that had been normalized by victims who were too young to recognize inappropriate behavior. Multiple women described private meetings where Bauer had questioned them about their romantic relationships in unnecessary detail, asking about their sexual experiences under the guise of providing guidance about college social life. Jennifer Walsh, now 48 and living in Pittsburgh, broke down during her phone interview with Torres as she described meetings with Bauer that had left her feeling confused and uncomfortable. He had insisted on meeting after school hours, claiming that his daytime schedule was too busy for proper counseling sessions. During these meetings, he had gradually shifted from discussing her college plans to asking intimate questions about her relationship with her boyfriend, her family's financial situation, and her plans for summer employment. Walsh had never reported the behavior because Bauer had been so skilled at making his inappropriate interest seem like professional concern. The pattern became clear as more women came forward. Bauer had been particularly interested in students from single-parent households, girls who worked part-time jobs and had irregular schedules that would make them harder to locate if they disappeared. He had shown unusual interest in their work schedules, their transportation arrangements, and their social plans. Several women recalled feeling like Bauer knew too much about their personal lives, information that went beyond what they had shared during counseling sessions. Most chilling was the testimony of Maria Gonzalez, who graduated from Millbrook High in 1981. She described an incident where Bauer had offered to drive her home from school during a thunderstorm, then taken a detour that led to a secluded area near Route 47, the same stretch of road where Emily's car would be found 2 years later. Bauer had claimed to know a shortcut, but when Gonzalez became frightened and demanded to be taken home immediately, he had quickly complied, apologizing for the confusion. She had never reported the incident, but 40 years later she recognized it as a close call with a predator who was testing her vulnerability. The surveillance footage from Bauer's current residence in Florida showed a man who maintained the same careful patterns that had served him for decades. He varied his routines unpredictably, avoided establishing regular schedules, and showed hypervigilance about his surroundings that suggested someone accustomed to watching for law enforcement attention. The behavioral analysis indicated a sophisticated offender who had been evading detection for decades, possibly responsible for multiple crimes that had never been connected to his name. The morning of March 8, 2023, began like any other Wednesday in the Sunset Palms retirement community. Michael Bauer was watering the small herb garden on his apartment balcony when he noticed the unmarked cars pulling into the parking lot below. His hands stilled on the watering can as he watched 3 vehicles position themselves strategically around the building exits, the occupants moving with the purposeful coordination that spoke of law enforcement training. For 40 years, Bauer had imagined this moment, rehearsed what he would do when it finally arrived, but the reality felt surreal, almost anticlimactic after decades of waiting for consequences that had never materialized. Detective Torres had coordinated with the Manatee County Sheriff's Department and FBI agents to ensure the arrest proceeded without incident. Bauer's age and apparent frailty made him seem like an unlikely flight risk, but his decades of successfully evading detection suggested a cunning that demanded careful preparation. The arrest warrant had been sealed to prevent media attention that might allow him to disappear again, and Torres had insisted on being present to personally place handcuffs on the man who had haunted her investigation for 3 years. When the knock came at his door, Bauer answered with the same mild expression he had worn while counseling students, offering coffee to the officers as if their presence was a social visit rather than the culmination of a murder investigation. He showed no surprise when Torres identified herself and read him his rights, his only visible reaction a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested someone processing the end of a very long game. His apartment was neat and sparse, decorated with photographs of former students and teaching awards that now seemed like trophies of successful deception. The search of Bauer's residence revealed the careful documentation of someone who had been planning for this possibility his entire life. Hidden in a locked filing cabinet were newspaper clippings about Emily's disappearance, photocopied police reports obtained through Freedom of Information requests, and detailed notes about the investigation's progress over the decades. The collection suggested someone who had been monitoring the case obsessively, tracking every development and preparing for the possibility that advancing technology might eventually identify him. Most disturbing was a collection of photographs and newspaper clippings related to other missing persons cases throughout Pennsylvania and surrounding states, organized by date and location in a manner that suggested methodical planning rather than casual interest. The FBI would spend months analyzing this material, cross-referencing it with unsolved cases and trying to determine whether Emily Flores had been Bauer's only victim or merely the one where his luck had finally run out. Bauer's extradition to Pennsylvania required 3 weeks of legal proceedings, during which he remained in protective custody, while his defense attorney argued that the genetic genealogy evidence was insufficiently reliable to support a murder charge. The media attention was intense but carefully managed, with law enforcement releasing only minimal information to avoid compromising the prosecution's case. Catherine Flores learned about the arrest through a phone call from Detective Torres, 40 years of waiting distilled into a conversation that lasted less than 5 minutes but changed everything about how she understood her daughter's death. The grand jury proceedings in Clarion County took place in the same courthouse where Emily would have appeared for jury duty had she lived to see her 19th birthday. The building's limestone facade and Art Deco details had remained unchanged since 1983, creating an eerie sense of time collapse as witnesses testified about events that felt both ancient and immediate. 23 citizens listened to evidence that spanned 4 decades, their faces reflecting the horror of learning that a trusted educator had been hiding among them while a family suffered in ignorance and isolation. The indictment was handed down on a grey April afternoon, the formal charges reading like an inventory of shattered lives: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. The document represented more than legal accusations. It was recognition that Emily Flores had been a real person whose death demanded justice, not just another cold case file gathering dust in a forgotten storage room. For Catherine Flores, now 78 and worn down by decades of unanswered questions, the indictment felt less like victory than validation, proof that her daughter's life had mattered enough to justify 40 years of investigation. The revelation that Michael Bauer had been Emily Flores's killer sent shockwaves through Millbrook that reverberated far beyond the courthouse steps, where reporters gathered to document the latest developments in a case that had become a symbol of justice, delayed but not denied. The man who had guided 3 generations of students through the complexities of adolescence, who had written countless recommendation letters and helped secure millions of dollars in college scholarships, had been harboring a secret so monstrous that it challenged everything the community thought it knew about trust, safety, and the capacity for evil to hide behind institutional authority. Former students struggled to reconcile their memories of a helpful, caring educator with the reality of a predator who had used his position to identify and potentially victimize vulnerable young women. Support groups formed spontaneously as women who had been counseled by Bauer decades earlier gathered to process their trauma and examine their interactions with him through the lens of his true nature. Many described feeling violated all over again, realizing that conversations they had treasured as evidence of adult interest in their futures had actually been interrogations designed to assess their vulnerability. The Millbrook High School administration faced uncomfortable questions about their hiring practices, background checks, and supervision protocols from the 1980s. Principal Janet Morrison, who had worked alongside Bauer for 15 years before his retirement, found herself questioning every interaction she had witnessed, every decision she had supported, every concern she had dismissed as unworthy of investigation. The school district hired an independent firm to review their historical personnel files, searching for patterns of behavior that had been overlooked or rationalized away by administrators who valued Bauer's effectiveness with students above their instinctive concerns about his methods. Emily Flores, now facing the trial she had dreamed about for 40 years, discovered that the approach of justice brought its own form of suffering. The legal proceedings would require her to relive Emily's disappearance in excruciating detail, to hear evidence about her daughter's final moments that she had spent decades imagining but never truly wanted to know. The defense attorneys had already indicated their intention to challenge every piece of evidence, to question the reliability of genetic genealogy, and to argue that 40 years was too long for any trial to proceed fairly. The community's collective guilt manifested in different ways throughout Millbrook. Some residents threw themselves into memorial activities, organizing scholarship funds in Emily's name and advocating for improved safety protocols in schools. Others retreated into defensive denial, arguing that Bauer's crimes were an aberration that reflected nothing about their town's character or their ability to protect their children. The divide created tensions that played out in town meetings, letters to the editor, and family gatherings where different generations struggled to process their roles in a tragedy that had unfolded in plain sight. Local law enforcement faced perhaps the harshest scrutiny as the investigation's failures became public knowledge through pre-trial motions and media coverage. Sheriff Murphy had died in 2015, taking his justifications and regrets to the grave, but his decisions haunted the current administration as they tried to rebuild community trust while preparing for a trial that would expose every mistake made during the original investigation. The Pennsylvania State Police announced a comprehensive review of cold cases from the same era, searching for other victims who might have been failed by inadequate investigations and limited forensic capabilities. For Emily's former classmates, now approaching 60 years old, with children and grandchildren of their own, Bauer's arrest felt like a reckoning with their own mortality and the fragility of the safety they had taken for granted as teenagers. Many had moved away from Millbrook decades earlier, but the news brought them back mentally to a time when the future seemed infinite, and danger was something that happened to other people in other places. They organized informal reunions to process their memories together, sharing stories about Emily that had been too painful to discuss, while her fate remained unknown. As jury selection approached, the weight of 4 decades settled over the courthouse like fog, heavy with the expectations of a family that had waited too long for answers and a community that had learned too late about the monster who had walked among them. The trial would determine not just Michael Bauer's guilt or innocence, but whether justice delayed could still be justice served, and whether a small town could find peace after learning that their trust had been so catastrophically misplaced. If this case has captured your attention like it has ours, we encourage you to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth investigations into cold cases that deserve to be remembered. Share your thoughts about Emily's story in the comments below. Sometimes the smallest detail from a viewer helps connect dots that investigators missed. Emily Flores' voice was silenced in 1983, but her story continues to speak to us today about the importance of never giving up on the search for truth.